Hey everybody, so we are looking at section 17.3, which is adding on to kind of where we left off and talking about Charles Darwin. And here we're going to look more specifically at his theory, which is more technically called natural selection. So not so much evolution, but he kind of came up with this theory that we refer to as natural selection, or a lot of times you'll hear people talk about it as survival of the fittest. All right, and so that's where we're going to kind of head today with this lesson. So the objectives for this, I've only got two of them. So we're going to look at what are the conditions in the environment that are necessary to promote natural selection, and then what do we know about evolutionary theory in terms of why we have so much diversity even within a single species of living thing, not just among all the living things, but truly like within a single population. So looking at Darwin's work here again, right? One of the things he understood based on his work kind of all over the world and the samples that he took and his reasoning behind, how species might have changed over time, it appeared to him that the environment is what was creating selective pressure, which would then determine what types of traits were actually going to be considered favorable. Now, when I say a trait is favorable, I mean that is a type of trait that becomes helpful for survival. So in other words, the more individuals that have that favorable trait, the more likely you're going to get survival when there's an environmental change. So if you happen to be the lucky one that has a favorable trait, you're more likely to end up surviving. Okay. So it's good to have these favorable traits. But in turn, then, those individuals that end up surviving are also more likely then to create offspring. And over time, what that means is as we follow generation after generation after generation, those favorable traits tend to kind of become more commonly seen in a population. They become more frequent. All right. And so natural selection is kind of that process. This is where we've got individuals that have those favorable traits that tend to not only survive longer, but also tend to produce more offspring relative to others that don't have the favorable traits. All right, so we can look at this example here of a bird that would be considered in this case our predator and the beetle that it's trying to consume. And so what we can see changing over here, if for some reason the bird is able to pick off and only see the beetles that tend to be this green color, it'll consume more of the green beetles just because it's easier for the bird to find those. What that means over time is that these that are kind of the tannish color end up surviving long enough and end up producing more offspring. So we go from a population here where we really started out with half and half. We had 3 green beetles and 3 tan beetles. Now, as time goes on, as we move to the right here, that population is changing. So the green ones get picked off, the tan ones continue to remain, and those are the guys that reproduce. So when they go through the process of reproduction, what we're left with is a population where the majority is that more favorable trait, the better trait for survival, or in this case, that tan color. Okay. One thing to recognize as we talk about this, when we think about natural selection, keep in mind the environment is never something that just remains the same, right? The natural world just doesn't remain constant all the time. So what that means is that whatever's favorable right now is not necessarily going to be favorable a year from now or even a week from now, right? So as the environment changes, those favorable traits may also change. And as a result of that, this tan beetle population may actually revert back and it may become better to be the green color, right? So they can kind of go back and forth, and we see this in populations happening all of the time. All right, so 4 main principles to Darwin's theory of natural selection. And so the first one here, and I try to kind of think about these as just terms, okay? I'm going to describe them for you also, but the first one is what we call overproduction. And I like to think of that as meaning over reproduction, which means we're having too many offspring. And that tends to happen kind of across the board for all living things. In general, we know that most species, most populations are going to have more offspring than can possibly survive and also produce offspring. So it's not that the population is just going up exponentially forever and ever and ever. What we're saying here is that the number of offspring that we have is not equivalent to the number that actually survive into old age. Individuals in a population can die off for lots of different reasons. If we're talking about something lower on a food chain, it could be that you're hunted, like the beetles we just saw. It could be if you're a plant, you just simply don't get enough sunlight, right? Kind of like the wrong place, wrong time. But this idea of overproduction kind of drives this process. So we have too many individuals, more individuals than can possibly survive, and that then leads to competition for resources. Okay, in general, the ones that have the best resources and can obtain those resources are going to be those that survive. Okay. Second principle, in order to get natural selection, we have to have variation also. And variation just refers to differences. So in other words, we have to have some variety in a population. If everybody is a green beetle and we don't have the tan color, well, then we don't have that variation that's needed to allow that population to survive and adapt. And so in time, that population could be potentially wiped out. So in general, when we think about populations as a whole, it's going to be a lot better if we have differences among individuals that exist in a population. All right, third principle to his theory, descent with modification or selection. What we mean by that is, or what he meant by that is, that over time, whatever's being selected for continues to be selected for, and we start to see those changes kind of taking over and taking place in the generations that result. So it says here on the screen, natural selection will result in species with adaptations that are well suited for survival and reproduction. So in other words, as those traits become more common in that population, the entire population itself may change in terms of the traits that we're seeing. Okay. Last one here is adaptation, which really ties back in with what I was saying in the first part there about overproduction. The fact that we have lots of offspring, the fact that we have some variation, means that by default, some things are going to be better than others, right? Some individuals will be better suited to their environment, and those that are better suited have those favorable traits. We call those favorable traits adaptations. So that's here, number 4. And these are those variations that allow individuals to survive and produce more offspring. In other words, they make them better competitors in their environments. Okay. So what I like to think about with this is variation can be anything. It can be good or it can be bad, but adaptation is always a positive thing. These are those favorable traits that we want to see that are super helpful for any population when we think about reproduction and survival and evolution over time. Okay. Now, when we think about natural selection as a whole, Darwin says we have to have all 4 of these factors present. So that means if we lack one of these 4, we don't get natural selection. All right. Now, luckily for most populations on the planet, all 4 of these remain true. Okay. So here's kind of a diagram representing those same 4 factors, but looking at one specific group. All right. And I think we're looking at deer, maybe. It must be deer, moose, deer, something like that. So with this, what we're seeing here first, number 1, it's not like these are in steps, okay, but we're thinking about one of those factors, overproduction. Every species, and in this case, the deer that we're looking at here, are producing more individuals than can survive and actually have offspring of their own. So that one's pretty simple. Again, over reproduction, right? Too many offspring. Variation, again, are just the differences in the characteristics that we see in those offspring. So in this example, we have different sizes, we have different colors, all right? One is probably better suited to the environment, and one is likely not as well suited to the environment. And we see that right here with this process of really descent with modification via kind of selection. So in other words, those individuals that have the best traits for survival get to survive, and those appear to be here those that have a darker colored coat. The lighter colored ones will die off. Also, the smaller ones appear to be dying off. But the darker colors are going to be more likely to survive. And so this is that idea of descent with modification. Over time, if these 5 are the only ones that are reproducing, my population will actually change in its appearance here, right, to better suit its environment. We went from a population here on the left with lots of tan deer and kind of an equal mix of both tan and dark. Now we have a whole lot of dark fur colors and a lot less of the tan color. So over time, those traits are selected for, and those traits then, because they are favorable, are what we call adaptations. Okay. So again, you kind of have to have all 4 of these if we're going to see actual and true natural selection. Okay. So a couple other pieces to kind of note about this. When we think about natural selection, we're not talking about actually what you inherit. We kind of are, but not directly. All right. So the first line up here says natural selection acts on phenotypes not genotypes. And a phenotype is a physical appearance. It's a trait. It's whatever's on the outside. It's what you can see when you look at something, okay? Genotype, on the other hand, represents the genetic information you actually got from mom and dad. Now, why we're saying here that natural selection acts on phenotypes is because the environment can only see kind of what it can see, right? Just because you have a certain trait doesn't mean that you have the exact same things going on the inside, right? So we could actually carry an additional copy of a gene that doesn't match the one that's being shown because of things like dominant and recessive. And so as part of this process, the only thing that an environment can really act upon in selecting what's best suited for an environment is going to be what's actually expressed, okay? And that can be physical traits, that can be behaviors, it can be a whole lot of different things, but what it is not is the genetic sequences in our chromosomes, okay? So as part of this, then, we don't create any new genes through this process. We only think about this as acting upon what's already there. All right. So in other words, if we scoot back here, with this population here, we're not creating anything new. We already had half of the organisms that had this darker fur. The other half had the lighter fur. So we didn't create anything new. We just simply chose, nature chose and selected for what was better in that specific environment. Just like that, if we go back a couple more to the original beetles example, nothing was created here. We started with green and tan, and we ended with green and tan. The only thing that changed is how frequent those traits were, meaning how many individuals were actually tan and how many were green, how those two numbers compared. Okay, so when we think about this, we're not creating anything new. Nature's only acting upon what's already present. So that's kind of why you have to have variation. If you don't have variation, nature can't act on anything, right? Either everyone survives or everyone gets wiped out, and that's about it, okay? So as I said before, environments, remember, are always changing. These are things that are not just constant and remain the same. And as part of that process, what we know is that what is viewed as being favorable and as an adaptation at one time is not necessarily always going to remain to be favorable and as an adaptation. All right, so over time, that can change as an environment changed. When Darwin thought about this, he used the term fitness, and it has nothing to do with how physically fit you are and how much you can bench press or anything like that. When we think about fitness, this is how able an individual is to be able to survive, to produce more offspring as compared to others. So where we get this term, and you might have heard this before, survival of the fittest, that comes from Darwin's idea here of fitness. So in general, those individuals that are most fit for their environments are going to be those that tend to produce more offspring, and that their offspring are going to produce more offspring. All right, those that are not as fit for their environment are not as likely to survive and are also not as likely to produce many offspring. Now, certainly there are exceptions to all of this, okay? But in general, you can think about it like this image here. The bird that has a higher fitness has a lot more offspring, and then their offspring also have more offspring. The bird here that has a lower fitness has less or fewer offspring as compared to the one on the right with a higher fitness, okay? So again, this idea of fitness is looking at exactly how many offspring can be produced and how well those offspring survive and also themselves reproduce. So if we look at another example, here we've got a population of grasshoppers with two different traits, what we would call phenotypes, right? So we've got the tan grasshoppers and the green grasshoppers. And if you saw what I just clicked to there a second ago, or if you can kind of infer from this, what we're seeing here is what appears to be maybe camouflage. And camouflage is a type of favorable trait that we know has been used by lots of different species as an adaptation. It helps with survival because predators can't capture prey. They can't simply see the prey. So grasshoppers in this case, the ones that are green, tend to blend into their environments, whereas the tan ones are not so good at blending in. And so what happens, the bird, the predator, swoops down and captures the tan grasshoppers. And so over time, you would imagine that these tan grasshoppers, as they're eaten, tend to start dying off. They don't get to reproduce. And over time, what that then results in is more of the green grasshopper population. You get a lot more green phenotypes as compared to these less numerous tan ones, okay? So we could say in this case that the tan grasshoppers have a lower fitness and the green grasshoppers have a higher fitness, all right? This will all kind of lead us into eventually what we're going to talk about regarding ancestry and diagrams that look a lot like this. So looking at how we went from common ancestors to current species. And you can see this is one example. These are what we call Darwin's finches, all of these right here. And this is believed to be the most recent common ancestor that, as you can see here, came from the South American mainland. So over time, as this finch spread out to these different Galapagos Islands where Darwin did a whole lot of his research, remember I said these islands were very diverse in terms of the geography, the climate that makes them up. Some are very dry and arid, and some are wetter, sunnier, like a tropical rainforest. And so when we look at these different finches and these adaptations that they've since developed, it seems very obvious that these were developed based on what they're consuming. So you have insect eaters here that have these thinner, narrower beaks. You have seed eaters that have these big, kind of thick, dense, that are able to crunch types of beaks. I don't know. I don't have a better word for that right now. We have cactus flower eaters, which are clearly going to be well adapted to where they're living, and bud eaters. And so among them, and then also I should mention here, this whole kind of half of the diagram where it says ground finches are birds that actually live on the ground. It's not they can't fly, but they live and they hunt on the ground. So they're going to be larger in body size than are those like tree finches and these warbler finches here that live and spend really the duration of their lives hunting and capturing prey in the trees. So what we're seeing here is this natural selection over time. We start with a common ancestor, and over time it became beneficial to have different traits. These have since, what we say, diverged and become entirely separate species, and they are classified as different species at this point in time. And the reason for that is that they cannot reproduce with one another or create fertile offspring. What belongs in this species can only mate with others of this species. They can't go and mate with anything else. And that's kind of the biologist's definition for a species, right? Being able to mate and produce fertile offspring, all right? And if you can't do that, you don't get classified in the same grouping, okay? So that's all I have for section 17.3. Let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, we will come back, and I'll see you again when we do 17.4. Bye, guys.